You're listening to the second ever episode of Time and Other Thieves, Reflections and Conversations on the Nature of Existence. This episode originally aired in radio format on June 17th, 2021. I'm Sarah B., and today I'm going to explore some of the ideas presented in the book Summerhill by A.S. Neill. The full title of the book is Summerhill, A Radical Approach to Child Rearing. A little later in the show, I'll be sharing parts of a conversation I recently had about Summerhill with Asheville mother and child educator Jess Spear. It might strike you as odd that I'm talking about child rearing on a program whose focus is the more philosophical and spiritual aspects of life. Or it might not. I like to define spirituality as getting beyond conditioning. And where do we acquire most of our conditioning if not in childhood? A discussion of Summerhill also follows naturally from last week's episode, which explored some ideas put forth in the book Awareness by Anthony DeMello. DeMello basically ends that book with a glowing review of Summerhill, which he calls a holy book, and he calls its author, A.S. Neill, a great man. DeMello said the book revolutionized the way he dealt with other people, and that he started seeing miracles everywhere after reading it. So when I finished my first reading of Awareness back in 2013, I promptly got my hands on a copy of Summerhill, and I instantly saw what all the fuss was about. I don't have any children, but Summerhill is one of my all-time favorite books. One word that various people have used to describe it is stimulating. I also felt a great deal of hope for humanity when reading it. It feels like taking really good, clean medicine. It softens your heart to all children everywhere and connects you with the pure and innocent parts of yourself, but not innocent in the way you might be thinking, that are too often exiled to the shadows. Its author, A.S. Neill, is whip-smart, hilarious, charming, bold, brave, and unflinching in his devotion to children. Indeed, he saw it as his primary job, the bringing of happiness to some few children. He knew that the reformation of society was beyond the scope of what he could offer. Of course, if everyone, every parent, and every institution dealt with children the way Neill did, society would most certainly reform. All of our values would change. We would know true freedom and practice true democracy. Erich Fromm wrote the foreword to Summerhill. He was a German social psychologist, psychoanalyst, humanistic philosopher, and democratic socialist. He wrote The Art of Loving, which will be the focus of next week's show. Reading Summerhill, Fromm says in the foreword, "I have felt greatly stimulated and encouraged." But while he found much to admire in Neill's work with children, namely his ability to really see them, and not to indulge in the rationalizations and delusions by which most people live, he contends that the Summerhill experiment can probably not be repeated in society at large, because there simply aren't enough people like Neill to pull it off, and because most parents lack, quote, the courage and independence to care more for their children's happiness than for their success. A.S. Neill does get pretty blamey in the book Summerhill, which is something I'll explore later in the show when I'm speaking with local mother and child educator Jess Spear. So we will definitely address that aspect of the book. But in many cases, it's not the individual parents that Neill blames for their children's behavioral or academic issues. It's mankind in general. There are no problem children, he says, only a problem humanity. And before we get into my conversation with Jess Spear, I just want to provide a little more background info on Summerhill the book, which was published in 1960 and is named after the school Summerhill, founded by Alexander Sutherland Neill in 1921. A.S. Neill was born in Forfar, Scotland on October 17, 1883. He was raised in an austere Calvinist house with values of fear, guilt, and adult and divine authority, which he later repudiated. His father was the village schoolmaster. He regularly used corporal punishment to control overcrowded classrooms. At the age of 15, Neill became his father's assistant pupil teacher, eventually becoming an assistant teacher in the small town of Newport-on-Tay. He adopted progressive techniques at the public school there and abandoned the corporal punishment he learned from his father for other forms of establishing discipline. In 1908, at the age of 25, Neill enrolled in the University of Edinburgh, where he majored in English literature. He became the student paper's editor during his last year, and in his editorials he criticized the tedium of lectures and the emphasis on tests instead of critical thinking. He began to develop his thoughts about the futility of forced education and the axiom that all learning came from intrinsic interest. Neill graduated in 1912 and began to edit encyclopedias and similar reference books. He returned to Scotland, working as a head teacher at Gretna Green School during the first year of World War I. He moved to England in 1924 and started Summerhill in Lyme Regis, changing the location in 1927 to Leiston in Suffolk, England, where the school still exists today. The Summerhill School that Neill created was a true democracy. Once a week, there was a general school meeting in which anyone was free to voice grievances or any ideas they might have for improving how the school ran. The vote of a 5-year-old student carried the same weight as the vote of a 60-year-old headmaster. Rules were designed and modified in these meetings, and punishments for those who'd broken already established rules were decided upon. For while Neill created Summerhill as a place that prioritized freedom above all else, he made a distinction between freedom and license. A child should be free, for instance, to decide what he wants to learn, but he should not have the license to use another's belongings without asking, or to hurt someone else, or to otherwise encroach on another person's freedom. To quote Neill, "Throwing stones involves others, but learning Latin involves only the child." When someone does throw stones or otherwise exercises undue license, a punishment naturally results. At Summerhill, everyone at the school voted on what they deemed a fitting punishment for a given transgressor. These punishments almost always related somehow to the transgression itself. For example, when 2 young students were caught using a ladder without first asking the ladder's owner for permission, their peers decided they should have to climb up and down the ladder for 10 minutes straight. With this process, defendants never showed signs of defiance or of hating the authority of their community. And if they did, if they expressed their sincere belief that the punishment did not fit the crime, then the punishment was usually adjusted until the defendant was okay with it. There was an understanding among the children that if someone felt they'd been judged unfairly, then they probably had been. In Summerhill the book, Neill writes a lot about punishment, decrying its more usual forms, which are far too often moralistic and the result of what parents perceive as disobedience. To punish a child for being disobedient, he says, is to liken oneself to God. But Neill was also immensely practical, never abandoning common sense. If a child were to hit him or kick him, he might just hit or kick that child right back, not to punish him, but to teach him that he cannot go about hurting others for his own gratification. To send children the message that it's okay to do as they please at the expense of others is harmful to them and will turn them into bad citizens. According to Neill, strict disciplinarians, those who rely on punishment as a means of controlling their child, are disapproving of themselves more than anything. Their disciplinary tactics are always projections of their self-hatred. And the result is that the child learns to not only hate the parent, but his own self as well. Hate begets hate, and love begets love. If a child feels loved and approved of, there will be little need for discipline at all. Quote, "In the disciplined home, the children have no rights. In the spoiled home, they have all the rights. The proper home is one in which children and adults have equal rights, and the same applies to school." My mother once said that discipline is something we give to our children, not something we do to them. A quick Google search of those general words informed me that one Dr. Becky Bailey said something very similar. Quote, "Discipline isn't something you do to children, it's something you develop within them." I'm sure A.S. Neill would agree. But how, you might wonder, does giving children so much freedom to do as they please instill them with self-discipline? I think it helps to look more closely at the word discipline. It's rooted in the word disciple, which comes from the Latin word for learner. So a person with self-discipline is essentially someone who has learned a lot about herself and from herself, someone who really knows herself. By allowing children to follow their own interests, which means we don't try to compel their interest via rewards or punishments or any other forms of manipulation. And in fact, according to Neill, interest cannot be compelled, only attention. They discover who they really are, not who their parents, teachers, and other adult members of society want or expect them to be. And when you know yourself, which is to say you understand yourself, then you love yourself, and you trust yourself. You cannot love what you fear, Neill says, and so many of us are taught, at least implicitly, on a nervous system level, to fear ourselves, or at the very least to not trust ourselves. But when we do trust and love ourselves, discipline, or self-control, naturally results, because we know it is in our own best interest to have such discipline. It's in our own best interest to, say, move our bodies regularly, to eat nourishing food, to keep a reasonably clean house, to engage in creative activities, to care about others' feelings, to always be learning. I'll bring Jess Spear in for this part of the discussion so we can hear some of her thoughts on A.S. Neill's approach to discipline. But first I'll let her provide some background info on herself. And I'll just say that I know Jess thanks to my community radio station, Asheville FM, where she and I both volunteer and where she also works as the station's volunteer coordinator.
My bachelor's is basically, I have like a liberal arts degree, and it's basically like a philosophy degree. And then I have a master's in library science, and I worked for almost 3 years as a children's librarian. And after college, when I graduated, I had spent all this time like reading Hegel and Kant and not enjoying it a ton, but being like very heady. And so I graduated and I was like, I don't know what I'm going to do next. And the next logical thing was like, I'm going to teach preschool. A friend of mine was teaching preschool and she was like, we need another assistant if you want to come and work with us. And I was like, that's exactly what I want to do. I want to like get back to the basics of not like, what is real, but like, what is a tree? Like, what are the colors? It's like,
You've become a homeschool teacher more recently of your own child, Henry. How has it been to homeschool in the pandemic?
I'm very devoted to the idea of public school. I think that it's really important, as a democratic, free society, that's something that we should do. The way that we do it, I don't think is the best way that it could be done, but in principle, I'm really interested in that. So, we enrolled Henry in public school initially, and then the pandemic hit, and yeah, he started kindergarten as a virtual kindergartner, and we did that for, I think, like maybe a month. Maybe we lasted that long, but I don't know if it was even that long. And I just could see, he was the kind of kid who was like, Mom, I want to do homework. He was so excited about learning and school, and we have these workbooks, and he was really interested in doing them, and he thought it was really fun. And a couple of weeks into school, and I could see that he was just like, oh, I don't like this. And he was making snarky comments about school, and I could just see all of that enthusiasm just draining out of him. It made me so sad because I didn't want, before he even really begins, for him to not enjoy learning or think that it was a fun thing to do.
Right.
I think I had always felt like homeschooling and sort of like radical unschooling was very appealing to me. Even as a kid, I was like, that is definitely the way to do it. And, when I was a teenager, I had these great visions for my adulthood that I was going to like, my kids were all going to be like radical homeschoolers, and we were going to do all this. It should be like this, or they were going to go to a school where that could happen. So I guess I kind of like got that dream, even though in the moment when I was enrolling him in actual kindergarten, I was kind of like, I guess that's not going to happen. And we're going to do public school, and that's going to be great. And we can be involved parents anyway.
Yeah.
And then this all happened, and I was like, oh, well, I guess here I am
Yeah.
living my dreams.
Jess was about 17 years old when she first read Summerhill at an
Alternative high school program that took place in our community college. And I think there's something similar here in Asheville at AB Tech. So I finished high school there. And so part of what we did there was we read Summerhill.
Wow.
And talked about it. And we had, they couldn't be totally Summerhill based, but we did have the choice in the beginning of the year to have either a benevolent dictatorship or to be self-governing and elect roles and things like that. And so we all decided we wanted to be self-governing because we were those kind of kids. And it was really fun. I mean, we really had a great relationship with our teachers. And even though, we weren't together as much as the Summerhill kids were, having that feeling of self-governance and being able to talk things through and be sort of in charge of ourselves was really powerful. And especially having read Summerhill, and I think we were all the kinds of kids who would have really benefited from a Summerhill experience. Like we needed that. We needed someone to say, I trust you to take care of yourself and to take care of each other and to be responsible, and you're smart, you can do this. So having just that little taste was good. But reading that book, it fulfilled all these things that I had been feeling, where I was like, this should be different. We shouldn't be constrained the way that we're constrained. And all these rules are really stupid and they have nothing to do with us learning or not learning. Like, why does it matter what kind of shirts we're wearing or if our hats are on backwards? Like that control just felt like way too much.
What stood out to you rereading it?
The thing that really stood out to me was the sense that really recognizing, and I recognize this over and over again, and I'm constantly fighting against it, this need for control that I have as an adult, which was what I really resented as a kid, that like, I want things to go a certain way. And because sometimes I have this moment where I'm like, well, I'm older, so it should go the way that I want it to go. And then I have to check myself and be like, well, but that doesn't mean anything. Like, that doesn't mean that I'm right. It doesn't mean that I have more rights than Henry does or any kid in my classroom has.
Right.
So that balance, I really have so much respect for the Summerhill teachers for being able to let go of so much control, but also for every teacher, like trying to balance that need for like safety and to be able to sort of like, you do have more experience and you do have more knowledge and you want to be able to like bring that to bear and sort of, be able to facilitate these experiences. But at the same time, it's like you have to let kids have some control and some autonomy and some measure of input into the environment and into the activities. And so trying to balance those things, I now see what that challenge is for on the adult side, to be able to like let go of control and say like, okay, you're right. Maybe we should do it your way and see what happens.
And as for how Jess feels about A.S. Neill's approach to disciplining children, as opposed to punishing them,
some of the solutions that he comes up with are things that I would never come up with, like, rewarding people when they make a bad choice, when they're like stealing and giving them more money,
Right.
And I just think like it obviously worked for him, and I love that. And I think that I guess the motivating factor for him there is to think like inherently this child is a good and moral creature. And I think that's something that it's kind of controversial, like philosophically, people have not always believed that. And by far, they've more often believed that, human beings are inherently flawed and immoral, and therefore we have to like prejudge them and that we all need to be saved because of, original sin or whatever. And I think that opposite idea of, appealing to the moral in the child and being able to say like, oh, actually here's $10 for taking those $10 you took before, like clearly you need more. I wish that I read that and I was like surprised again by that, like, oh, who would think to do that? Such an opposite thing, that like that idea of like I should punish this infraction or whatever becomes so ingrained in all of us just because that's like our social norm. You hear about kids getting suspended from preschool. I mean, as a preschool teacher, I know we had policies where it was like, if you're hurting other people multiple times, at some point you take a break from school. But we would never say like, your child is suspended. I don't know. You hear these stories about kids being suspended from preschool for things where I was like, what happened leading up to that? What conversations were had with the parents? Like, how is how is punishment dealt with at school? Like, how do they deal with these things? Because a 3-year-old, doesn't know yet. You can't,
No.
that doesn't work for them.
A.S. Neill would say that suspending a child from preschool is a blatant act of hatred for that child. Any form of punishment, when doled out by an authority figure or institution, is felt as hatred, because that's what it is. And that applies to adults too, he says. Prison sentences can't reform the criminal because they are only proof of society's hatred for the criminal, who then doesn't want to gain their approval by reforming. He says that, inasmuch as we're all basically starved for love, that we're all potential criminals. And by love, I think Neill would agree with Anthony DeMello's definition of the word, or the verb, to see something as it really is, not as you imagine it to be, and to give it the response it deserves. Summerhill contains the premise that every child has a God in him, and our attempt to mold the child will turn the God into a devil. At Summerhill, the school, freedom was the top priority, and a major manifestation of this priority was the total lack of mandatory classes. Classes happened every day of the week, and students who wanted to attend them did, but if they didn't want to attend class ever, they didn't have to. In his decades of running Summerhill, Neill consistently saw children learning what they needed to learn in order to thrive in their own particular way, in accordance to their natural interests and talents. He believed that learning was important, but that the modern education system put way too much emphasis on it. Teachers in that system only dealt with the part of the child that's above the neck, making the, quote, emotional, vital part of the child foreign territory. He says, if the emotions are permitted to be really free, then the intellect will look after itself. Therefore, learning should come after play. Childhood is playhood. And society pays a hefty price for not respecting a child's need for play. Neill says that the evils of civilization are likely the results of no child ever having enough play. Civilization is essentially anti-life, forcing children to be adults long before they reach adulthood, because the actual adults are terrified that kids won't learn anything, won't be successful in school and career if they spend all their time playing. Neill would say to them that children who are granted the freedom to play as much as they want will be able to learn the necessary information in order to pass any tests required for them to pursue any career they desire, in a much shorter amount of time than children who have not been granted the same freedom and instead have been forced to learn material that didn't interest them or that didn't at least represent a step toward a goal that they genuinely valued. The reason that Summerhill graduates regularly got glowing reports about their industriousness at responsible jobs is that they'd lived out their self-centered fantasy stage at Summerhill. As young adults, they were able to face the realities of life without any unconscious longing for the play of childhood. And what is play but freedom? It's an unproved assumption, Neill says, that giving such freedom to children would come at the expense of their adjusting to the demands of life later on. It's an unfounded claim, in other words, that a child will not grow or develop unless forced to do so. And as for how children react to freedom, quote, its chief outer sign is a great increase in sincerity and charity, plus a lessening of aggression. When children are not under fear and discipline, they are not patently aggressive. We need to believe in the personality and the organism that we call a child, and be determined to do nothing to warp that personality and stiffen its body by wrong interference. End quote. Forcing children to learn things that don't interest them is a most common wrong interference, which ultimately conditions them for jobs they will not enjoy. I think this idea merits a closer look. I'll rephrase it. A child who's forced to learn things that don't interest her is a child who's conditioned to lead a life that doesn't interest her. Or we could circle back to the self-trust idea and say, when a child's instinct is to play and she is told that this other thing, whatever it might be, is more important, she learns that her instinct is wrong and therefore can't be trusted. She learns that what brings her pleasure is wrong. Few things, maybe nothing, is more damaging to a human psyche than this sense of being judged for what pleases us. And it happens all the time. It's why the phrase guilty pleasure exists. And I'd venture that more pleasures than we're even aware of are guilty ones. Some part of us feels bad for resting, for eating rich food, for accepting a compliment, for grinning when happy. And of course, there's our deeply messed up relationship with what Neill describes as the greatest pleasure in the world, assuming love is involved: sex. What Neill has to say about sex could fill at least an entire episode of this show, but I'll condense it to a few minutes. He says that sex is repressed in this society because it is the greatest pleasure. He says that those who insist on repressing sex, on being shocked or offended by it, are the most perverse of all. In one of my favorite quotes from the book, Neill says, "The prude is the libertine without the courage to face his naked soul." He says that adults need to be honest with children about sex, to never suggest that masturbation is wrong, to speak truthfully about how babies are made. He says that a lot of a child's neurosis, whatever form it might take, springs from the felt sense of being lied to about sex and somehow made to feel ashamed for their own sexual nature and for how they might have expressed it. Children are not innocent, he says, when it comes to sex, at least not in the way that adults have defined innocence. They are genuinely, in a very pure way, interested in their own bodies and in the bodies of others. By expecting them to not act on this interest, to not interact with it, as they do with everything else about the world that interests them, as that is how they learn, adults pervert the child's sexual instincts. By insisting on the child's supposed innocence, they steal his actual innocence. And the surprising thing, Neill says, is that with millions reared in sex hate and fear, the world is not more neurotic than it is. To me, this means that natural humanity has the innate power of finally overcoming the evils that are imposed on it. This is Time and Other Thieves, reflections and conversations on the nature of existence. I'm Sarah B., talking about the book Summerhill by A.S. Neill. I'll bring Jess Spear back into the discussion now. I was very curious to know what she thought of Neill's philosophies on sex as it applies to child rearing.
I like how non-dramatic he is about it, because I think there is so much sex panic for adults with kids. My mom is a wonderful mother. And it's a family tradition in our family. There's this story passed down about I think my great-grandmother, who believed that all children are born with a light, and the role of the parents who care and the adults who care for that child is to make sure that light is not blown out. So I love that, and I think that's like a very good strength in my family. But the sex attitudes were not a strength for my mom. She really believed that not only did children have this beautiful light, but that they were like sexually pure and should be shielded from that information for as long as possible.
And what does it mean to be sexually pure? That means
like innocent, like ignorant, and just not having any sexuality at all. Right. Which, I was pretty young when I was like, I don't think that's right. So I think that's something for me as a parent that I've been very conscientious about doing differently, is to really kind of acknowledge that, like, it's part of your body, there's a part of your body that feels really good, and that's it. It's inherent, there's nerves. It's not like, it doesn't have to be a big deal. And then how we talk about it from there is really like where you're setting the stage for it to be a healthy thing or a neurotic thing. it's like such a big challenge, and it happens so much sooner than I think most people expect it to, which is why I
Right.
think for so many parents, it's right away like, nope, just like put a lid on it. Let's not, you're too young, But yeah, that's something that I talk to a lot of my parent friends about is like, how are you talking about this? When are you talking about this? Like, I'm in part of a group of moms and we're all very sex positive. And so we do a lot of talking about, like, how do we talk to our kids about consent
Mm.
in sexual and non-sexual ways, and how do we talk to kids about privacy and safety and like, body autonomy and, all of those things. It starts so early, people think about like those conversations happening with teenagers, but you have to start from the very beginning.
How do you feel about the parent blaminess? It's very blamey, this book, don't you think?
I do. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
He's definitely got judgments for people. I don't think he's wrong though. Parents don't get any special training about how to raise a child or child development or any of that. I mean, I can't believe that we give teachers the hard time that we do when it's like no one's training parents, no
Right.
one's requiring parenting classes. That's not part of
Right.
what happens in your hospital stay or as part of like your pediatric visits necessarily. Like a great pediatrician might be talking to you about like brain development and educational things that are going on, but
That's such
not
a good
all of
point.
them do.
Yeah.
So, I think as an expert in child development, he has every right to be judgmental of parents because
Mm.
we don't know what we're doing. But I think if you're going to do anything that deviates from what the social norms are, you really have to kind of be like, you're always remembering, why am I doing this? What is the goal? If you're going to parent in a way that you're treating your children like they are autonomous creatures, you really have to work against all your social programming.
Mm.
Remember all the time, because it's so easy to just slip into this, like, so easy to, they're pouring their own milk in their cereal and the milk goes everywhere. It's so hard for your first reaction not to be, oh, why did you do that? And instead pull that back and say, oh, looks like we had an accident. Let's clean it up. No big deal. That's the thing. You have to always be ready to sort of pull back that reaction of the adult and give the loving parent reaction that's on the child's side and say, okay, what can
Yeah.
we do to fix this together?
One other thing about Summerhill I think is worth mentioning is that, and that made it maybe a lot easier for Neill to, realize this vision of radical child rearing is the other children, right? I mean, they're in a school setting surrounded by other children, and the other children are playing a huge role in raising them.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think even if you have, siblings, unless you have a lot of siblings, you don't get that experience.
Yeah.
And it's something that we just recently were able to be with our like some of our closest friends who also have kids. And it was a situation with 3 families with kids ranging from, 6 months to 6 years. I think 6 was the oldest kid. And so there were, all these kids and all these grown-ups, and we were able to sort of like communally be with each other as a family. And it was so amazing and so powerful for me to be like, oh, there are so many other adults. And granted, we're like on vacation, so
Yeah.
we only had to do like a little bit of work because it was that kind of vacation. But to be able to say, oh, well, the kids come over here, like the kids are outside doing the slip and slide with one grown up, and the rest of us are, 2 people are preparing meals and someone's
Yeah.
doing something else. And,
Right.
just so nice. And the kids were loving it because they can be around each other, and the older kids help the younger kids, and having that kind of social element and social support is
Yes.
so important. And if I
Rare.
learned anything from this year, it's just, well, and from parenthood in general, because in Henry's first years, we were super, super isolated. We didn't have a lot of friends with kids. And then a lot of our close friends just coincidentally moved away from Chicago where we were living. So we were just sort of like, okay, I guess we're just like people with a kid now.
Yeah.
And That's it. And it was so hard. And I think, people who are in a community where you have that kind of support and it's multi-generational and you have lots of people involved in your family life and in your kids' life, so important. I love having Henry be a part of, like, a natural part of my working life, and be able to come to the place where I work and know the adults there and have adult friends. He's made friends with the neighbors we have first. He was the first one to, like, make social contact and get to know people, and then we were like, oh, I guess great, that's wonderful. But then, now we have these people who are involved in our life as a family, and it feels like so amazing to have that social support and the community.
A village, right? Takes a village.
But the other part I'm thinking about the neighborhood full of kids, because we have some kids on our block, and Henry has gotten to, especially now that the weather is warm, after school, they're all running around, and he goes out and they all run around together, and they, mess up my garden, and they have a great time. They water my plants. It's really, really fun. And I'm so happy he has that experience. But I think, like, we used to have so much more of that. And I think part of it too is that the birth rate is so much lower now.
Yeah.
We have fewer kids. It's not a super appealing prospect anymore to have kids.
Well, right, because it means the end of your life, which, wonder if you have any thoughts on that. Might be veering pretty far away from Summerhill, but
I think it's related. I mean, to me, the central theme of Summerhill is that kids are important, right? That they matter, and we should invest in them and be thoughtful about the way that we raise them and educate them. And if kids don't have freedom, if kids are, so bounded and they have to be monitored at every moment and controlled and molded in all these ways, and everything has to be like this, that's terrible for parents too. I mean, the feeling of, like, I'm going to be branded as a bad mom, or have, child protective services called on me if I'm not doing things in this correct way, is, and then being abandoned socially once you become a parent, I think, is part of that whole idea. I mean, we had a friend who was very, very close with us, and then very obviously not interested in hanging out with us anymore after we had a kid, and, like, didn't really like our kid. And it was a very hard thing to lose friendships and feel like, some of the social support I thought I did have wasn't there because of parenthood. And I think all of those stigmas against parenthood, where it's like, your life is over, you're boring, if you're an artist or something like that, like, your career is probably going to be over. Kids are not invited to gallery openings, kids are not invited to art residencies, kids are not invited to shows or, museums or things like that. Like, those are hard things to navigate as a parent. All of that, plus, maybe the world is ending.
right.
Do we even really want to bring more people here? I don't know.
Right. Welcome
So
to our sinking ship.
We're hoping that recycling will help this, but hopefully not.
I brought my own bag, to quote Mark Maron. Well, we're anti-children in so many ways. I mean, your example of the friend you lost kind of just made me think that, like, she didn't like our kid. She probably didn't like any kids. I think a lot of people don't like kids, and that's, I think, something to be more curious about.
And I think culturally too, we've made it so uncool to be enthusiastic, to be interested in things, to be silly and lighthearted. Like, it's not cool. You're supposed to be, like, cynical and jaded and, like, and all of that is anti-child, because kids are in the world just like, whoa, look at this all the time. Like, everything is so exciting and so interesting, which, ultimately was why I went against all of my, like, the world is probably ending. Should I bring a person here? Can I, like, ethically do that? And then I was like, but I want to go to the woods and have someone be like, look at this bug. That's what I like, is that it brings me back to that, like, oh my gosh, that's right. The whole world is this, like, totally amazing place.
So you think they have more to teach us maybe than we do them?
I think they have a lot to remind us of. I think, they they're people, so they have a different perspective, and they have really good ideas, if we're willing to listen to them.
Mm.
And also, I mean, just like on like a neurological, physical level, their senses are more engaged. Like our brains have taught us to phase out
Right.
more and more of our sensory input over time. It's just what happens.
Yep.
And kids are open to so many more things, so they notice so much more, and their like experience is so much richer than ours. And so I think if we can tap into that and what they see and experience and sense around them, we can
Mm.
learn a lot and notice a lot more, and remember a lot of those things.
What you said about their senses just kind of being more raw and awake, it just makes it even more heartbreaking to think about what we force them into doing with so much of their precious young lives, which is forcing them in directions that their senses aren't taking them, right? And these abstract lessons about math and stuff, like, we can't keep squandering that natural. I mean, they come in with this gift of being so alive, and we try to make them like us.
We don't even want to be like us,
I know. We want
I
to be
mean,
like them.
we want to be like that. We want to be free too. I mean, I think it's a real chicken and egg. I can never decide whether it's like the adults need to get free first in order to liberate the children. Maybe we all need to do it at once. But, as a parent, I think, in dreaming about how the world could be a better place, I think if we could incorporate parenting classes or child development and those ideas into like high school curriculum, college curriculum, so that's just part of what you're learning about how to be an adult. This is how children learn and grow, and
Yeah.
these are the developmental stages. So that's just something that we all know as like a baseline that gives it value and a place socially as like valuable information. And then, like mandatory therapy.
Yeah.
That like we all need to heal a little bit before we can raise another person. If parents can process the things that we were raised with that, injured
Yeah.
us, we
Right.
won't reenact them with our kids. We won't replay that same drama, and force on them the things that were enforced on us. And instead, we can we can each get free from those things.
Do you have any final thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think the main thing is to know that people are doing this in other ways around the world. It's
Yeah.
not just Summerhill. There's a lot of different variations on this. There's,
Mm-hmm.
the unschoolers and project-based learning and Reggio Emilia, and people have been working on how to teach children for a long time. And I hope that people in charge, eventually, someday, the people will be in charge who listen to that, because I feel like there's so many systems of learning that we've proven time and again are better than what we do in public schools, but we never change what we do in public schools. And like, we've always done this thing, so we have to continue to do it this way because it's right. But
Mm-hmm.
we should have an educational system to make healthy, beautiful humans.
Big thanks to Jess Spear for talking with me for this second ever episode of Time and Other Thieves, Reflections and Conversations on the Nature of Existence. Again, the book that inspired this episode is called Summerhill, A Radical Approach to Child Rearing by A.S. Neill. Neill's motto was, "For heaven's sake, let people live their own lives." I'm Sarah B., and in the next episode, I'll be talking on my own about some of the ideas that Erich Fromm explores in his book, The Art of Loving. I hope you'll check it out, and thanks for listening.